morning, good people. My name is Elizabeth Hammond, and with your permission, I would like to tell you about an amazing year that I spent on this short island in 1648. At the time, my son Robert had the misfortune to be the governor of this place. I remember clearly that when the Civil War started in 1642, my son Robert then was serving in Ireland, serving for His Majesty the King. But as the King took up war against his people, my son, along with my brother-in-law, along with his godfather, the Earl of Essex, they all felt it was their duty and their honour to serve the Parliament. And for the next 5 years, this terrible war was raging. I lost my eldest son, John, a year after the war began. And Robert fought his way through the whole war. And twice he was wounded. Once he was imprisoned for fighting a duel, which he was honour bound to do. And at the end of this time, he was feeling so dispirited and so exhausted by the experience that he asked the army to release him from his commission. Now, the reason why was because although the king had been captured in 1647, the war was not really over, and while the Parliament were making plans for the future, the army had their own plans, and they got more and more radical as time went by. And one of the plans that a big faction had was that they should dispose of His Majesty altogether. Now, this was not something that any member of my family would ever consider, and our only wish as a family was that His Sacred Majesty King Charles would be returned to his throne, and having seen the error of his ways, the country could get back to normal living. And so Robert asked to be released from his command, and much to his surprise, the army, instead of just dismissing him, they agreed with the Parliament that he should become the governor of this place. The reason being that the Isle of Wight was very quiet, and that he was somebody who had suffered greatly during the conflict, and so he was appointed to come to the island. It was a strange appointment because it is the Parliament that decides who shall be a governor, but it was the army that actually appointed him. And that was the beginning of a lot of trouble. So my dear Robert arrived on the island in September of 1647 to be greeted with great solemnity and pleasure by the people of the island. Though it was a very quiet island and it was parliamentary in theory, during the war there were some very important people of consequence who were out and out royalists, and so he had the job of trying to find peace between the two factions, and it was something he was very good at doing because he was diplomatic, and they were all very pleased with the way that things were progressing. And then it happened in November of that year, while he was out riding, he heard horses following him, and he stopped to see who was coming. And it was two gentlemen he recognised immediately, and one was Sir John Berkeley, who had been the governor of Exeter Castle, and the other one was a man called John Ashburnham, who was a member of the royal household. And when they caught up with him, they told him that they had some very important news, and that even at that moment, His Majesty King Charles was nearby. Well, it was such a shocking statement because King Charles had been at Hampton Court, and was in custody there. But in fact, it seems that he was in fear of his life, and so he had run away. And he had arrived on the coast of England and gone to Titchfield, where his friend the Earl of Southampton lived. And he was then deciding what he must do next. And having thought about it, he thought that Robert Hammond was somebody of great honour, and he trusted him sufficiently to ask if he could seek sanctuary with the king. And as it turned out, of course, King Charles had not realised that his two friends had actually explained where he was. Now this was some terrible discovery. Good afternoon. And the sad thing was that now Robert knew where the king was. He had no choice but to actually go and meet the king and bring him back to the island. Well, the king was very angry, but he still came. And when they arrived on the island, they stayed in Cowes for that first night because there was nowhere in the castle to place His Majesty. And so he stayed in the Plume of Feathers in Cowes. And then the next morning they rode into Newport, and the word had been got round so quickly that His Majesty is on the island. And people turned out, and there was much cheering and people prostrating themselves on the ground because of the fact the king was here. And he was escorted to Carisbrooke Castle, where my dear son gave up his apartment and his room so that His Majesty could be comfortable. And in the meantime, poor Robert had been up the whole night writing letters, both to the Parliament, to the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and to Lord Cromwell and to the army, and explaining this amazing situation that had arisen. And it's quite important that having sent off all this information, he also added a note saying, as soon as convenient, please would they arrange either to remove the king to some other place or to post him to some other place, because he didn't feel that he, as a person, could cope with this responsibility. But in fact, nothing happened. And plans were made now to try and make the king as comfortable as possible while some sort of negotiation took place so that they could have, invite him back to London and to go as really to return him to his post. But as it turned out, they sent down the king's belongings, and 35 members of his household arrived to make him comfortable, including his barber, because he hadn't had his hair cut because he was nervous about anybody else near his person with a razor. And both the Parliament and the army had emphasised that Hammond must not allow the king to go forth. They must keep him under control at all times. But when he mentioned His Majesty about some anxiety about him leaving, he swore that he would not leave this island. And my dear son believed him. So they took the king out for lovely trips. He went to Freshwater and he saw the Needles for himself. He had tea and with the family at Thorley, the Urries. He went to Bonchurch, and while he was at Bonchurch on a visit, there was a funeral cortege passing, and it turned out to be a man called Ralph Chamberlain, who was one of his loyal supporters who had received a wound during the war. And so King Charles went to his funeral. He went frequently to Brading, where his dear friend Sir John Oglander lived. And all in all, he was feeling quite comfortable and quite satisfied with the way things were going. And then the parliamentary commissioners had made a plan so that they had certain points that they asked the king if he would agree to, and that would be the start of a treaty, and then he could go back to London. And so they arrived on the island on Christmas Eve. As you will know, that Christmas was not celebrated at that time. It was a lot of frippery and not something to be treated as anything other than a religious period. So they arrived and they were presented to the king, and they gave him the 4 particular conditions that they wanted him to agree to. And when the king saw them, he said, well, he must have time to look at them himself and consider them. And so they went away, feeling quite confident. But what they didn't realise, and what nobody realised, was that King Charles had also been in touch with the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish commissioners. And on Boxing Day, they also turned up with their own set of proposals, because the king was believing that he might get a better arrangement with the Scots than with the English. And so nobody realised at the time, but afterwards it turned out that the king had in fact agreed with the Scots that he would turn England into a Presbyterian country in condition on condition that they gave him all the other things that he needed. And of course this would have gone down so badly. Nobody in England would have accepted that they should become a Presbyterian nation. But they went away, they had a treaty, and they lived quite happily. And when the parliamentary commissions came back the next day, they were presented with a sealed envelope. But they said, no, we must know what it is that you've said. We come, we're not messengers, we are the people who had come to negotiate with you. So the king had to open it. And it was immediately, obviously, they had no intention of dealing with them. And so they were very angry, and they went away, and Robert went with them to escort them to the boat. But on the way, they told him of various rumours that had been going around that the king had made definite plans to leave the island. And in fact, they were very imminent. And as he came back in, he was furious to think that this had been going on behind his back. So for the first time, he had the castle gates slammed shut, and the king was not to be allowed to leave anymore. And what, again, we didn't know was that on that very day, King Charles was planning to leave the castle. There was a ship waiting for him in the bay. There were horsemen outside the gates, organised by local people. And it was only when he looked out of the window and he realised from the weather vane that the wind had changed direction. And so there was no likelihood of the ship being able to move. And so he realised that he would just not be able to do so. And now, of course, it was too late because the gates were shut and his plans were being realised. Well, Robert was very angry with the king, but the king was equally angry with him, of course. And down in Newport, there was a big to-do going on because the word had got round that the king now was a captive. And there was a rather foolish man called Burleigh, who was a captain in the army, and he was irate at the thought that the king might be treated in such a way, and so he tried to raise an army to come and rescue the king from the castle. Well, there was very little response. A few people showed some interest, but because there was so much unrest, it was conceived to be absolutely necessary to arrest him, and he was put on trial for treason. Well, I have to admit to you that it's very difficult to commit an act of treason if you're trying to rescue the king, as treason by its very nature is doing something against the king. But he was put on trial for treason and he was executed. And unhappily, although it was not my poor son's doing, he was the person who got the blame. So now there was a whole different situation. Everything was much more tense. More soldiers were being brought in to make the island safe. Nobody could come to the island or leave without Robert's permission. He also had the problem that the newsmongers were arriving in force, trying to find stories that could make the public more excited about this whole issue. And also people were turning up in droves to be touched by the king because of this belief that his sacred majesty had the power to cure one. And they were given regular entrance to the castle to meet his majesty, and the job of keeping him safe became increasingly difficult. And everything just ticked along for a few weeks, but then Robert got a message saying that a certain information had come to the Parliament that the king had actually tried to leave the castle. This was in end of March. But there had been some problem and he had not been able to do so. And as we found out later, His Majesty had convinced himself that he could easily climb out of his chamber window, and once again there were horses waiting for him and a ship ready to take him away, and he had been warned that it might be rather difficult to squeeze through this small space because there was a window bar, but he wouldn't have any of it, and when it came to the point, he pushed his head forward and started to pull out, and then he got stuck. So the man waiting downstairs, Harry Firebrace, he didn't know what to do. They certainly couldn't make a noise because they didn't want to rouse anybody's, awareness. And then the king eventually managed to struggle back, and Firebrace threw stones over the wall to tell the waiting horsemen that nothing was going to happen. And Robert was getting so furious that 2 o'clock in the morning he couldn't sleep, and he knew that there was probably correspondence in the king's room, so he made his way to the king's chamber, and Charles, who was actually awake, was very outraged that he should come, and Robert started to search His Majesty's room, and immediately the king rushed to a corner, grabbed some papers and was feeding them into the fire. A tussle then took place, and unfortunately the king hit his face, and so he had a bruise on his cheek. And the news sheets, they went wild, and they were accusing of Robert of mistreating His Majesty and calling him a foul beast. But he was so busy trying to sort out everything else that we didn't have time even to worry about it. And the same thing happened again a few months later, when there was another rumour that the king was going to break out, but Robert had taken the precaution of moving him from that room, and also of having a platform outside his room with soldiers on guard, which seemed to cover everything. But the guards, in fact, were bribed so that they would, turn a blind eye if the king climbed out of the window. But at the last moment, one of them really got, 2 of them rather, got really cold feet, and they thought that they should, admit to what was happening. So they were told that they must really carry on as normal. And it was very difficult to predict what night this would be, because the weather had to be right. It had to be a dark night. The wind had to be blowing in the right direction. And these particular guards had to be on duty. But the night arrived, and as soon as the king began to try to escape, the soldiers turned up and they arrested the other 2 guards. Although they had, in fact, they had declared what was happening. And the 3rd man was shot and is probably buried in St Mary's Church in Carisbrooke. We don't quite know where he is. But the king, His Majesty did not seem able to understand that he was in such a serious position. He was having correspondence with all these people. One of his servants, Richard Osborne, was the keeper of the king's gloves, so he would stand at the table and put little notes in the fingers of his gloves. Another one was he would wait until Robert's guards were on duty, because there were always 4 men, 2 by 2, on duty night and day, sleeping outside his bedroom door at night. But this, I can't now remember which of his guards it was, but Robert trusted him implicitly, but in fact he was a royalist officer, and he was generous enough to the guards to say, if you would like to go and have your supper, then I will wait here, so that you needn't worry. But they would go off duty quite happily and leave him there, so that he made a little hole in the wall, and he and the king could talk to each other, and then they could pass notes to each other. And so it went on throughout the summer. Things got more and more difficult. Robert kept writing, asking for more men. He asked for money because Sandham Castle was falling down. The little fort at Gurnard was falling down. He just needed more of everything, and it just wasn't coming. And he wrote again and again asking to be released. And it wasn't until September that the Parliament finally decided that they've just got to make another effort to deal with the king, and that they would release him from the castle. He could have the freedom of the island again, because now they were dealing with him, in an honourable manner, and that he moved down into Newport and stayed there, and that the old grammar school at Newport was to be the hall where they would have their negotiations. And then so many people began to arrive, royalists, supporters, negotiators. They were all staying in Newport. The cavaliers who came were frequently getting drunk every night and drinking toast to His Majesty, which was upsetting the local people, so there were fights and trouble. And Robert now had this additional job of trying to keep the peace and to keep the king safe, when the king very definitely did not want to be kept safe. And the negotiations started, and they started very well, and the king agreed to all the first item on the agenda, except he missed one word out, and when they looked at it closely, it just altered the meaning, so it had to go back to be considered again. And day by day, this was dragged out, and it became again increasingly clear that the king was not prepared to accept the conditions that were being imposed upon him. And the religious one was a very important one. He was not prepared to allow any other, anybody else to have any sort of control over what happened about the religion. And of course the army, he wanted control of the army, and he was told no, uncertainly that he wouldn't. He had to agree that Parliament would be called regularly, and that was something that he grudgingly accepted. But while the Parliament kept on doggedly trying to get an agreement with him, the army, which is much more radical, they had had enough of this. And so they said if nothing happened, then they were going to come and take the king away. So Robert's trying again to protect the king, not to allow this to happen, because his duty was, it was to the Parliament, as they were his bosses, but he was still a serving officer. So all these, all demands were coming that were totally one against the other. And eventually he got a message saying that he was to go immediately to army headquarters, and he left, and he just got to the mainland when he met an officer coming in the opposite direction and said, for God's sake, you should not have left, go back immediately. But as soon as he tried to return, he was arrested. And the army arrived on the island, the army officers, and they arrested the king, and they took him across the water to Hurst Castle and to London. And very sadly, His Majesty was put on trial, and as we know, he lost his life. But as for my poor Robert, first of all, he was in huge trouble with the army for having failed to obey orders. But for once, common sense seems to have prevailed, and they realised that he was in this impossible position, and he could not, disobey the people who had employed him. And so he was released, and he was given a pension, and he went into virtual retirement for several years, in effect. And having got over the trauma of the whole thing, one of the problems was that if he took any position, because now the army was moving, the country was moving more and more towards having a republic, and he personally was not prepared to sign a document. I think it was called the, not Degree of Enlightenment, but it was, in effect, one had to recognise the republic as the legitimate rule in this country, and he didn't feel able to do that. So in effect, he could not be employed. But in the meantime, I'm happy to say that he married, and that I had 2 beautiful granddaughters, and that he settled in Reading, and he was an MP for Reading, and all in all, life was going quite peacefully for him. But then when Lord Cromwell was made the Protector, he was very fond of Robert, and he now he offered him a position that he felt he could not refuse, and that was to go to Ireland, back to Ireland where he had been as a young man, and to work on the tax system, in fact, in Ireland. And so he agreed to go, and he set off in November of 1654, and unhappily, within a few weeks of being there, he developed a terrible fever, and he did not recover. My poor son died at the age of 33. His body was not brought back to our country, and he was buried in the cathedral in Dublin. And within a few months, his wife gave birth to his 3rd child, and it was another little girl. So now I had lost both my sons. I feel great sadness. My daughter-in-law married very quickly and moved to Norfolk, where she has many more children. And I am very, very sad that this terrible situation arose. And I hope you will see that my dear son really did act honourably and always did his best for the king and his country.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.